We were at question 67 of Prima Secunda, now in the Treatise on Good Habits, otherwise known as the Virtues. And question 67 has 6 articles on the duration of the virtues after this life. So if you have ever wondered what happens to the virtues, the moral virtues, the intellectual virtues, the theological virtues, after we die, do we still have them? Do we need them? Do they exist in heaven? If you've ever wondered that, well, you are much like St. Thomas Aquinas, because that is what he has in his mind in these 6 articles. That's actually quite interesting. You know, which of them do last? And so St. Thomas would be a good resource to learn about this. The first article, whether the moral virtues remain after this life. So moral virtue would be chastity or patience or long-suffering, or there's a lot of different moral virtues, fortitude, and the things that fall under temperance and fortitude and those kind of things. So do they last after this life? He says, as Augustine says, Cicero held that the cardinal virtues do not remain after this life, and that, as Augustine says, in the other life men are made happy by the mere knowledge of that nature than that which nothing is better or more lovable, that nature to wit which created all others. Okay, so he's saying we got the beatific vision. What do we need the moral virtues for if we have the beatific vision? But he says afterwards he concludes that these 4 virtues remain in the future life, but in a different manner. In order to make this evident, we must note that in these virtues there is a formal element and a quasi-material element. The material element in these virtues is a certain inclination of the appetitive part to the passions and operations according to a certain mode, and since that mode is fixed by reason, the formal element is precisely this order of reason. Okay, that's, as we have talked about so much with the virtues, that is what the virtues are about. The moral virtues working with a intellectual virtue like prudence and understanding in order to have an act that makes us good, a good action, right? But there has to be an intellectual virtue based on reason, prudence, understanding, and also the moral virtue as well. Accordingly, we must say that these moral virtues do not remain in the future life as regards their material element, for in the future life there will be no concupiscences and pleasures in matters of food and sex, nor fair and daring about dangers of death, nor distributions and commutations of things employed in this present life. So he's saying there's no need for temperance, there's no need for fortitude, there's no need for justice in the next life, because it'll be perfectly conformed to reason, and that's what these virtues do. But as regards the formal element, they will remain most perfect after this life in the blessed, inasmuch as each one's reason will have most perfect rectitude in regard to things concerning him in respect to that state of life, and his appetitive power will be moved entirely according to the order of reason. So he kind of is having it both ways. He's saying, in a sense, we don't need it, but on the other hand, it will be perfected, because everything will, the reason will entirely control the passions, and there won't be any bad passions, as we've learned about. Whether the intellectual virtues remain in this life, some have held that the intelligible, this is really interesting. It gets a little bit deep here, but hang with me, because this is important when it comes to knowledge and acquiring knowledge and phantasms and all those kind of things we learned in the treatise on human nature. Some have held that the intelligible species do not remain in the passive intellect except when it actually understands. Now, to talk about intelligible species, we are getting metaphysical, because intelligible species are metaphysical by their very nature. Somebody like Immanuel Kant would call this the noumena, as opposed to the things that are perceptible or that we can apprehend with our senses. And so this really is a very important concept when you talk about the history of philosophy, right? As opposed to phenomena. That's Kant separated phenomena and noumena, and so so long as actual consideration ceases, the species are not preserved save in the sensitive powers, which are acts of bodily organs, that is, the powers of imagination and memory. Those are 2 of the interior senses that we have, right? Now these powers cease when the body is corrupted, and consequently, according to this opinion, neither science nor any other intellectual virtue will remain after this life when once the body is corrupted. Okay, so there's a certain association of the body with these intellectual virtues. But this opinion is contrary to the mind of Aristotle, Aquinas says, who states that the possible intellect is in act when it is identified with each thing as knowing it, and yet even then it is in potentiality to consider it actually. It is also contrary to reason because intelligible species are contained by the possible intellect immovably according to the mode of their container. Hence the possible intellect is called the abode of the species. Okay, so all the species of all things that we can know is in the passive intellect, passively, right? And then he says, and yet phantasms, by turning to which man understands in this life, by applying the intelligible species to them as stated, cease as soon as the body is corrupted. Because to abstract a phantasm takes the body and the mind. It takes the senses to see something, abstract it, and then the active intellect, makes us to understand it, right? Hence, so far as the phantasms are concerned, which are the quasi-material element in the intellectual virtues, these latter cease when the body is destroyed. But as regards the intelligible species, which are in the possible intellect, the intellectual virtues remain. Now, the species are the quasi-formal element of the intellectual virtues, therefore, these remain after this life as regards their formal element, just as we have stated concerning the moral virtues. Okay, so just remember with the moral virtues, you don't need them because you don't have concupiscence, you don't have the need for fortitude or temperance or justice because everything's perfect. But he's saying in the same way, you still have, from what I understand, the intellectual species are still in the passive intellect because that's part of the human nature. At least that's how I'm taking it to mean. And so in one way you don't have the intellectual virtues, and in another way you do. Okay, let's leave it at that. All right, so whether faith remains in this after this life. Opposition of itself. Okay, opposition is of itself the proper cause of one thing be excluded from another, insofar as wherever two things are opposite to one another, we find opposition of affirmation and negation. Now, what he's going to say is that faith is an imperfect knowledge. Charity is perfect. It's resting in the beloved, right? So those two are, in a way, opposed to each other. Now, we must take note that sometimes imperfection belongs to a thing's very nature and belongs to its species, even as lack of reason belongs to the very specific nature of a horse or an ox. And since a thing, so long as it remains the same identically, cannot pass from one species to another, it follows that if such an imperfection be removed, the species of that thing is changed, even as it would no longer be an ox or a horse if it were to become irrational. So I think he's saying if you take the element of faith away from us, there's something we lose in our nature. At least that's what I think he's saying. Now it is clear that imperfect knowledge belongs to the very nature of faith, for it is included in its definition, faith being defined as the substance of things to be hoped for, the evidence of things appear not, Hebrews 11:1. Wherefore Augustine says, where is faith? Believing without seeing. But it is an imperfect knowledge that is of things unapparent or unseen. Consequently, he says, imperfect knowledge belongs to the very nature of faith. Therefore, it is clear that the knowledge of faith cannot be perfect and remain identically the same. Okay, so I think he as he always does, he's going back and forth and saying, is faith something that's inherent in the human nature, but it is opposed to charity because charity rests in that which faith is able to, to at least believe in, but not perfectly, whereas charity is perfect. We must also consider whether it is compatible with perfect knowledge, for there is nothing to prevent some kind of imperfect knowledge from being sometimes with perfect knowledge. Okay, it is evident that a thing cannot be perfect and imperfect in the same respect, yet the things which differ as perfect and imperfect can be together in the same respect in one and the same other thing. Accordingly, knowledge which is perfect on the part of the object is quite incompatible with imperfect knowledge about the same object, but they are compatible with one another in respect of some medium of the same subject. All right, so he's really having it both ways here. Faith of its very nature contains an imperfection on the part of the subject, that the believer sees not what he believes, whereas bliss, by its very nature, heavenly reward, bliss, implies perfection on the part of the subject, that is, that the blessed see that which makes them happy. Hence it is manifest that faith and bliss are incompatible in one and the same subject. Okay, so that's a long way of saying no, faith does not remain after this life. Does hope remain after death in the state of glory? He's going to come to the same conclusion with this, because hope is aspiring for something that you don't have, right? You can't hope for something that you have, but when you get to heaven, you have it, right? You're in bliss, you're resting in the beloved. So let's just leave that one at that. Whether anything of faith and hope remains in glory. It's quite funny that he just keeps on kind of plugging away at this, and he's already said there's no faith and there's no hope. But so in Article 5, does anything of faith or hope remain in glory? The reason he's asking this is the first sentence here. He says, some have held that hope is taken away entirely, but that faith is taken away in part, as to its obscurity, and remains in part, that is, as to the substance of its knowledge. Okay, I think he's already kind of covered this, but then he says, it is impossible for the identical knowledge, which was previously obscure, to become clear vision. It is therefore evident that in heaven nothing remains of faith, either identically or specifically the same, but only generically. So kind of repeating himself. All right, finally, whether charity remains after this life in glory, and you probably have already figured out that it will. He says, when the imperfection of a thing does not belong to its specific nature, there is nothing to hinder the identical thing passing from imperfection to perfection, even as man is perfected by growth and whiteness by intensity. Now charity is love, the nature of which does not include imperfection, since it may relate to an object either possessed or not possessed, either seen or not seen. Therefore, charity is not done away with by the perfection of glory, but remains identically the same. So yes, charity does remain, faith does not, hope does not, intellectual virtues, in one way they do, moral virtues, in one way they do. So again, you don't always get this black and white yes or no answer from St. Thomas Aquinas, because he's looking at things from a lot of different angles. So hopefully that was satisfactory for you, and I appreciate you watching, and I hope you're enjoying journeying through the Summa Theologia with me. We are next going to go into the gifts of the Holy Spirit, which interestingly fall under the treatise on good habits, and we'll tell you why that is the case tomorrow. I hope you come back. God bless you.